Welcome to the North Africa and Southwest Asia region. For this week, a massively spanning part of land and culture. Let's first take a look at why and what makes this a region. To outsiders, we have here the region as characterized by five main qualities: the center of Islam, the locus of much of the Earth's petroleum resources, overall scarcity of water, predominantly, although not entirely, Arab in ethnicity, and that women face significant discrimination. However, they are playing an increasingly important political role. So, what you may know about the region already is perhaps the fossil fuel reserves made up of oil and natural gas formed over millions of years from fossilized remains of dead plants and animals, particularly around where there used to be inland seas. These are found mainly around the Persian Gulf. Very prominent world fuel supplies there. And many people in the region are not Arab. Second and third most populous countries in the region, Turkey and Iran, are of non-Arab ethnicities, mostly, as are many minority populations such as the Kurds, Berbers, Christians, and Jews. The role and status of women is in transition. Women are beginning to lead the fight for gender equity in the region, and their life options are expanding, as we'll see more in this mini lecture and take a look at throughout the week. Important terms. In our book, the authors choose not to use the term Middle East. The Arab world is used only where it applies, since many people in the region are not of Arab ethnicity. And importantly here, the term occupied Palestinian territories refers to the Gaza and West Bank, areas where Israel still exerts control despite treaty agreements that would recognize these as independent territories. The U.S. Department of State uses the term Palestinian territories, and the UN, or the United Nations, upon recently giving the territory observer status, refers to it as the State of Palestine. So state here meaning nation state, or what we commonly hear as country. So just a brief look at the physical geography and environmental issues that underpin this region. You can see here a visual display of some of the stunning landscapes throughout the region, whether it be in Saudi Arabia's deserts or the steppes of Morocco. Morocco also has some phenomenal mountains. And scrolling down just a bit, you see the lower right is in Turkey, and the lower left photo is of the Mediterranean coast in Algeria. We can see some very significant vulnerability to climate change throughout the region, particularly in the northern parts of the Saharan Desert, down in Qatar as well, Yemen. Much of this is politically driven on top of environmental stress. Climate change and desertification go hand in hand often in this region. Climate change can accelerate desertification as temperatures increase, soil moisture decreases because of evaporation, and plant cover becomes reduced. This provides less protection for the arid soil. Groundwater levels fall because water is being pumped out for cities and irrigated agriculture. What's important to keep in mind here as well is that international development agencies have encouraged settlement of nomads and asked them to take up cattle ranching. This has also contributed to desertification. Some of the backfiring consequences of different international development work see common amongst many regions of the world. To take a quick look at human geography, you've probably heard of the term the Fertile Crescent. This refers to this crescent, or this arc, between the Zagros Mountains of Iran spanning into northern Iraq and looping down the Tigris River into the Persian Gulf. Between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, nomadic people settled in the uplands of the Tigris and Euphrates in northern present-day Iraq. And This is part of the region that became known as the Fertile Crescent. And importantly here, what's very important to keep in mind is that this is one of the original birthplaces of agriculture. And we would be remiss to not talk about the very important religious history of the region, Fertile Crescent, and broader yet, here, the coming of monotheism. The belief based on the idea that there's only one God began to emerge several thousand years ago, challenging the religions of the day that believed in many gods. So firstly, Judaism, founded about 4,000 years ago. The patriarch Abraham led his followers from Mesopotamia to the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, where he founded Judaism. And the Jews rebelled against the Roman Empire. They were expelled in 73 Common Era from eastern Mediterranean coastline, and they were enslaved by the Romans and migrated to other lands in the diaspora. Here we have a key word that we see come up in many different ethnicities and cultures, migrating, moving around the world. This is a dispersion of an originally localized people. So besides the Jewish diaspora, we can think of many different diasporas, including the Irish diaspora in the late 19th century, starting in the mid 19th century. More recently of global renown is the Chinese diaspora, more and more Chinese people moving around the world. So this can be based on both push and pull factors as well, not necessarily in terms of stress. Christianity emerged later than Judaism based on the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, a Jew who, claiming to be the Son of God, gathered followers in the area of Palestine about 2,000 years ago. Jesus taught that there is one God who primarily loves and supports humans, but who will judge those who do evil. And the coming of monotheism continued. You can see Jesus' execution in Jerusalem in about 32 Common Era. His teachings were written down by the Gospels who followed him. His ideas were interpreted by these writers, spread in what became known as Christianity. And lastly, Islam, now the dominant religion in the region, emerged in about the 7th century Common Era after the Prophet Muhammad transmitted the Quran to his followers by writing down what was conveyed to him by Allah. And followers of Islam, known as Muslims, believe that Muhammad was the final and most important in a long series of prophets, which included Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. So there's a direct lineage between these monotheistic religions, something that's often forgotten. There are three holy books, all share significant parts of what's known to Christianity as the Old Testament. And this is, further indicates the similarities between them that is often forgotten in media and popular society. Here we see the spread of Islam, or we could think of it as another diaspora as well. Very interestingly color-coded between different centuries. The Ottoman cities facilitated vast trading networks spanning the known world. As we see there in the top center region, Ottoman Empire was based out of what's current-day Turkey. Istanbul became the cosmopolitan capital with elaborate buildings and lavish public parks that outshined anything in Europe until the early 19th century. This was hundreds and hundreds of years before that. And under the Arab empires, the Christians, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, they practiced their religions, but they were allowed to practice their own religions, but there were economic and social advantages to converting to Islam. So we see a wide expanse into Spain, even Toledo and Andalusia, down into southwest to Timbuktu, eastward, continuing eastward from off of this map into the Indonesia and beyond. In contrast, we see the division of the region by colonial regimes in the early part of the 20th century, leaving a stark and lasting impact, especially in Israel and Palestine currently, and many other places of Africa as well. And the globalization and development front, very important to recognize the fossil fuel exports from the region. European and North American companies were first to exploit the fossil fuels reserves in the early 20th century. They only paid governments small royalties for the rights to extract oil. As the oil and gas prices have risen and fallen dramatically since '73, when the governments in the Gulf states raised the price of oil and gas, and they started OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, formed a cartel that facilitated the price hikes in 1973. OPEC members cooperate to restrict or increase oil production and significantly influence the price of oil on world markets. It's important to keep in mind that many OPEC countries were exceedingly poor 40 years ago, but have become much wealthier since 1973. They also became more vulnerable to economic downturns as a result. This arose in 1973 for the Gulf states were imposing penalty in response to U.S. support for Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War between Israel and the neighboring Arab countries, when Israel began invading other countries. So here we see major OPEC flows, very large arrows from the Middle East headed to Asia in particular. The width of the arrow there indicating greater amounts of flow. And you see OPEC Latin America as well, with Ecuador and Venezuela. It's important to keep in mind that OPEC doesn't only include North African and Southwest Asian countries. And world reserves of oil is another very interesting chart to pay attention to in your text. We see some of the big players such as Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iraq, very large countries represented proportionally there. Also with who's using the oil. On the power and politics note, it's important to remember here the Arab Spring that took place just 7 years ago. Political protests swept across North Africa in 2010 and into Syria by 2011, eventually resulting in the toppling long-standing dictators in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, however not in Syria. This political disquiet or disruption reflected the fact that historically, most governments in the region gave citizens little ability to influence how decisions were made. So it's, these are citizen movements that were in rebellion, and in contrast to the dictatorial or authoritarian regimes. People across the region saw governments as unresponsive and corrupt, and themselves as powerless to influence the government in any way. There was a neat correspondence between Occupy Wall Street in many cities of the West, as well as what was happening with the Arab Spring. Pizzas being ordered for each other from Cairo into cities in North America, and support in North America and Europe for the Arab Spring as well. What's also important here is that the role that Islam should play in society has been a most contentious issue of long-term significance. Relates to determining which system of laws should be adopted, those advocating for a more secular approach to governments versus fundamental Islam, as well as which protections women should be offered. Very salient issues. The Arab Spring, here we see here is shown in colored mapping. Governments overthrown, large-scale protests, small-scale protests, and in contrast, even no political strife. So, the role of the press, media, and the internet cannot be overemphasized in this. It's very important. In much of the region, journalism can often be risky, often leading to imprisonment. In Saudi Arabia, dozens of newspapers and newsstands are controlled by the royal Saud family. Al Jazeera, founded by the Emir of Qatar, has affected climate for political discourse across the region, sets a high standard for journalism. Hopefully some of you have been able to watch Al Jazeera or read Al Jazeera. The role of the internet and cell phone technology has, as a force for political change, emerged during the Iranian protests in 2009. Iranians with video-capable cell phones meant that the world instantly saw via the internet the brutality of the Iranian police and army. Democratization and women. Most countries in the region now allow women to vote. Israel and Turkey have elected female heads of state, in the past that is. Nevertheless, women who want to actively participate in politics still face many barriers. However, patterns are changing as more women become educated and employed outside of the home. And finally, a quick note on population and gender. Population growth rates are higher in societies where women are not accorded basic human rights, are less educated, and work primarily inside the home. So as those conditions change, women have less children, as we see around the world. Although fertility rates have dropped significantly since the 1960s in this region, 3.1 children per adult woman in 2012, this is still significantly higher than the world average of 2.6. So deeply entrenched cultural preferences for sons in the region is both a cause and result of women's lower social and economic standing, unfortunately, and also contributes to population growth as families sometimes continue to have children, but they have a desired number of sons. And we see here some of the key pictures from the text. While the region has notably more restrictive customary and legal limits on women, for instance, the ban on women drivers in the Gulf states, changes have been made as women become more active in public life, including just last year, more women being able to begin driving in Saudi Arabia. So that wraps it up for this mini lecture, and I look forward to your questions and our discussions down below. Please post. Thanks.